Our speaker tonight is Nikhil Bahl. He is a full-time professional photographer who, like many of our presenters, often wears many different hats. He is also an author, an instructor, educator, and an environmentalist. He currently resides in the Washington, D.C. area, and his work is featured in galleries in the Washington metropolitan area, as well as many private collections. Nikhil draws inspiration from nature to create photographs that transcend the commonplace, reflect deeper insights, and convey an enchantment of the subject's beauty, which is all things that I'm sure he's going to get into tonight. As a volunteer with the National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, his goal there is to portray environmental stories with an artistic appeal so that his photographs educate and motivate people about the imperative nature of conservation. And each year, Nikhil leads several photography tours and instructional workshops in the U.S. and abroad. His teaching encourages participants to advance beyond ordinary photos and develop their own style and vision. He is a regular speaker at photography clubs, expos, and industry events, and he's authored the acclaimed ebook, Creative Interpretations, and he writes on the creative and technical aspects of photography. So, Nikhil, I'm going to let you take it from here, and I'll be watching for those questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. All right, so I have a lot to cover during this webinar, so I'll get straight into it. I'm essentially going to be talking about the photographic process as it relates to my approach, as well as the photographs that you're going to see. Some of the things we're going to talk about are, the impact of photos, how you can communicate with them, the importance of processing, how you can transform your subject, and also evoking emotion, amongst other things. Portraits are very popular amongst wildlife photographers, and I always find like a really powerful portrait is when you get really close. And getting close to the snowy egret in breeding plumage with the wind kind of ruffling its feathers, I thought made for a really cool shot where at least, when somebody looks at it, it's like, okay, well, it gets your attention. And generally what you want to do with animal portraits, you want to find friendly subjects. And there's an ethical issue where some people will continue to push a specific subject till they've got the shot. I prefer it not to be that way. I'd rather be natural. If that specific specimen is not giving you the opportunity, just move on and find another one. And there's always a friendly one that you can get close to and get a photograph that can make a lot of impact, especially as you're getting close and you can see a lot of the detail. In images like this, I prefer to have a shallow depth of field and keep the focus on the eye. I think that's the most important thing. I don't mind that the beak is slightly out of focus and parts of the feathers are out of focus. The main focal point is always going to be the eyes. That's where the viewer is going to look at first. Subsequently, you can always document the subject and its behavior. Now, this is again a portrait, a full frame portrait of a great egret preening. And as they say, if you put yourself in front of pretty things, you get pretty photos. And this is kind of one of those photos where you may have seen it a lot as well. But here you don't see the photographer, or at least I don't think that the photographer brings anything specifically to this image. Yes, it's a great capture and it's the right moment, but I'm not adding something to it with the way I am looking at this subject. However, you can always put your spin on it. This is not the exact same situation or the exact same bird, but what I've done is I have chosen to kind of almost abstract it a little bit. I've gone in tighter, and this was taken off a boat while the other one was taken off a boardwalk. And I'm basically just trying to portray the same subject in a different way, but I'm focusing on what inspired me in this particular photograph, and that was the plumage, obviously, and the egret displaying, and there was just enough breeze to get it to blow one way. I still kept the focus on the head and the eyes of the bird, and the rest of it kind of fell where it may. And I always look for situations like this where I can get a naturally black background when the contrast is high, especially when you have a white subject and a darker background. You can expose for the highlights, and then depending on the dynamic range of the camera, you essentially can get the background to almost fade to black. And of course, a little bit of that can be done in post-processing as well, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I prefer not to get like static portraits. This is just a little bit of action. You know, it's pretty much a full frame shot or close to full frame, but I'm getting a little bit of movement or implied motion in the photograph, which I think kind of enhances the feeling and the impact of the image as well. Getting some of the snowfall, coming up, the position of the paw, and of course a little bit of that detail in the snow. Images like this, you don't expect to get a lot of detail in the snow anyway. Number one is I'm using a very long focal length. I'm using a 600 mm and a 1.4 teleconverter. Therefore, my depth of field is pretty shallow. So you're not going to get that much detail, but also it's very overcast as well. So there's really going to be very soft light and therefore no contrast in the snow at all. Including the environment, I feel, is something that is underutilized. And this may not be a great environmental shot, but it's definitely a photograph that shows you a little bit of the element of surprise almost. And these two photographs were taken about an hour apart. This was taken first. The one I showed you before was taken about an hour after this. And when I find a subject that I will not photograph very often, or I don't think I will, like a bobcat, I will then try and get the most out of that particular situation. I'll just stay there until the animal is gone, or I need to move on for whatever reason. But including the environment, I feel, is something that is very, very underutilized by most wildlife photographers, partly because it's a little hard to get like a good composition out of it, but also because I don't think everybody sees a wildlife photograph that way. Most kind of are very into kind of capturing the detail and the impact that I showed you in the preceding images.
I was going to ask you too, how long did you sit and wait for those? You said it was an hour in between, but I mean, how long should someone sit and wait if they think
in that situation, I was not leaving till the bobcat was gone. Let's just put it that way. But I actually ended up spending about 2 hours with that bobcat, and I was, excuse me, I feel like I was so right to do that, because ever since then, I've had only 2 other good opportunities to photograph a bobcat, and there have been nothing in terms of the time that I spent. I've had maybe 10, 15 minutes, and I've never been that close to the bobcat either. So when I recognize that it's a unique or unusual situation with the opportunity I may not get, I will definitely not leave. And I'll talk a little bit, and I was going to talk about that with this photograph as well. While approaching there was a skimmer flock on the beach, and the skimmer in the foreground is a black skimmer. The one in the foreground is a juvenile, and the one in the background is a adult. And it took me about 15, 20 minutes to get close enough to get images like this. But I use that time. Of course, I'm taking photographs along the way. I know I may not keep them, but it keeps me engaged. And that's the point. It's like, you stay engaged with the subject. And as I kept moving closer and I got to where I want to be, and then I start to kind of take the photographs. And photography in its very basic sense is a way of communicating visually. So we got to always think about, what are we trying to say with our photographs? What's the message? And in this particular case, I wanted to show the juxtaposition of the juvenile and the adult. Now, of course, the focus is more on the juvenile, but you get a sense of what it might look like as an adult. And if this can also work really well in the body of work as well. But as I waited and continued to photograph the birds, I started to realize, like, what is it that makes the skimmer unique? And I realize it's really the beak that is so unique. And if compared to the previous photo, you can see the side-on view where it looks like a very normal beak that most birds have. Once you see the bird head on, you realize, oh my God, that is a razor sharp beak. And that's how they feed. They feed on the wing, and they'll put their lower mandibles actually larger than the. I'll go back here. As you can see, even in the juvenile, you can see the lower mandible is bigger than the upper, and that's how they feed. And so to me, that's what makes this bird quite unique. And so I wanted to focus in on that and convey that through this particular photograph. And I'm also simplifying the image. Everything is very soft around it. The reason it's so soft and you can't see its feet is because I've gotten so low that I'm actually getting a layer of sand that I'm shooting through to get this particular effect. And the same message can be conveyed in different ways. And so here's an action shot, but you still see how sharp the beak is or how thin the beak is. And that's what I'm trying to do with both these photographs. They both kind of convey the same message in a different way. Obviously, this one has a little more interest, in my opinion, just because it's more of an action shot. And you'll also notice, if you're looking at the metadata here, I've shot this at 5.6, which is pretty much wide open with my 600 mm and the 1.4 teleconverter. And the reason this was shot wide open is because I wanted to get the smoothest, softest background so that I don't have that much detail, and I can, get the best, or rather I can highlight the bird the best. And yes, some of that can be done in software, but I'd rather do it in the field. And this is probably cropped about 5 or 10% just for composition. But again, both these images convey a similar message in terms of at least showing the beak of the bird. Now here's where I took my time getting to this point for two reasons. One is this is an image of a ghost crab, and you can see there's a little bit of motion in there. The reason I chose to use a slower shutter speed is because I wanted to show how busy it was. Now, all that sand that you see to the right of it is all sand that it's dug out of that hole, and it was going in and out, and it was tossing the sand across. And so I wanted to show how busy it was. And ghost crabs are very sensitive to vibrations, shadows, so it's very difficult to get close to them. This one was a juvenile, which allowed me to kind of get a little closer, but I had to be very slow, very methodical. And it took me probably 15, 20 minutes to get into this position. And then the ghost crab would not come out. So I had to wait a considerable amount of time before it actually started doing its routine. But all of that considered, why did I choose 1/4 of a second? Well, 1/4 of a second, I wanted to get a little bit of that blur. And you see that it's partly sharp and then partly blurry. And that's because for the time the shutter was open, it was not static all the time. So it started to move during the shutter being open. And at 1/4 of a second, I was still able to get a sharp photograph. The sand, etc., is sharp, only because I'm choosing to, really crunch my abs and stop breathing and just be as still as I can. And of course, I'm using vibration reduction as well, which helps greatly.
So on that, were you using a tripod for most of those photos?
No.
Are you a tripod kind of guy?
No. This is definitely not a tripod, as I explained.
Right.
I had to be, because I couldn't set up the tripod. It would have caused vibrations, and the shadows of the tripod would have affected it. Most of my the photos of the bobcat that you saw were all in monopod. I tend to shoot a lot of my wildlife photos with monopod just because it gives me the flexibility of moving very quickly without having to worry about the tripod legs being collected and then moving and then spreading them again. I use faster shutter speeds, of course, but it gives me the stability that I need, especially with using a 600 lens. And I think the one with the egret uh, that that was a close-up, that was taken off the boat, so that was a handheld photograph. But most of the wildlife photos that you've seen so far were all taken on a monopod.
And then on these, were you clear about the amount of blur you would get, or did you just kind of estimate it?
That's a good question. And so I had a sense, and this is just from previous experience of uh, photographing motion, I had a sense that 1/4 of a second would be good enough. But there's a little bit of experimentation there in terms of, when I actually click the shutter, because am I clicking the shutter and is it going to move, or am I going to click the shutter, it's not going to move, or do I click the shutter while it's moving? So there was a lot of that, and I can't even tell you when I clicked the shutter, because in the end I probably took too many photos. But the idea was to take advantage of the situation, and I'm not ashamed of saying, hey, I took too many photos, because in the end I wanted to get the shot that I wanted, and I think I did.
Right. And then what did the polarizer do for you on the crab shot?
Okay. So the reason I used the polarizer was actually to slow the shutter speed down just a little bit. I had been shooting the crab or another crab as well, and I was not getting a slower shutter speed. I could have bumped my ISO down, but I wanted to keep the ISO up just because I wanted to keep changing my shutter speed and have um, different shutter speeds to work with as I experimented with this. So normally I would try and shoot this at ISO 64 or my base ISO for the camera. But in this case, I bumped it up just a little bit so I could, go faster or go slower if I wanted to. And I just put the polarizer on to give me just a little more contrast and a slightly slower shutter speed.
Smart.
Okay. So processing, I think processing has obviously become a big deal in the digital age. And for photographers like me, I'm kind of what I refer to as a subject focused photographer. I'm not really interested. Of course, I'm interested in the final image, but I respect my subject, and I capture the photograph because I liked what I saw. So I'm more subject driven. While an image driven photographer could very well use the photograph as a starting point and then do any kind of post processing manipulation, add a tree, remove a tree, etc., and do whatever they want with their particular image. So I don't necessarily do that, but I do want to get the best out of the raw capture that I create. So this is the final product, and I'm going to show you what this photograph looked like right out of the camera with no processing at all. And so this looks like essentially a throwaway because you really can't see any detail at all. But that's how I'm shooting for my raw files. I'm pushing the histogram way to the right, making sure I don't get any clipping. So a lot of my photographs will look kind of drab and, they have no contrast. But in the end, I knew the detail was there, so I was able to bring out the snow, which was falling quite heavily at that point. And I knew that there was just enough contrast, or I could bring out some contrast to get this effect of the snow falling. And yes, I know you could quite easily do the same effect in software, but I think it's kind of cool that I was able to capture that out in the field.
So, what factors go into your decision on which body you use?
That's a good question. So with wildlife, I'm mostly shooting with the D5 because I'm always trying to be ready for the action. D5 has probably the best autofocus system on the market right now. Maybe the D6 is better. but it's pretty amazing in terms of what it can do. So as far as wildlife goes, I'm always waiting for that action shot, or I'm ready for the action. And I know with the action, I'm going to need the best autofocus. So I always stick with the D5 in most situations. There are a few times where if the subject is very far away, or I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm going to want to bring out a lot of detail, then I may go with my high res camera with the D850. But usually for wildlife, I will use the D5. And for landscapes, I will tend to use the high res cameras because I may want to print very big, I just get the maximum detail out. And of course, the dynamic range on the D850, for example, the D810 as it is in this case, is more than what you would get with a D5. So that's pretty much what I try and do is I'll use for like more static subjects, landscapes, etc. I will use a high-res camera while my action camera is essentially the D5. Okay, so with this particular image, you're probably looking at this and saying, wow, that's a pretty drab looking image. Well, this is once again right out of the camera. And I wanted to show this specific one because if you notice down here, I've used the Singh-Ray 10-stop more slow filter. And so I was able to get a 30-second exposure out of this scene. And this is taken during daylight hours. So I had to use a 10-stop, and it was slightly underexposed, as you can see. But processing is so important. And if you look at the final result, I've kind of brought this to life a little bit. And you should kind of expect to do something like this with long exposures because things tend to soften up. You tend to lose a little bit of the saturation. You tend to lose a little bit of the contrast, especially in areas like the clouds, the water, where there is some amount of motion. And, always you got to be cognizant of the light on the subject, and the light's not illuminating every part of this scene equally. So I had to work on that post-processing to get the look the way I wanted it, and the way I felt was true to the scene, the way I almost saw it, obviously, except for the slow-moving water. So one more example of post-processing. And here's the final image. This is after I've processed this particular set of HDR photos or HDR image. What I ended up taking was about 5 photos, one stop apart. Now I ended up using only 4 of those 5 photos I took. And because a lot of people, if you're not familiar with HDR, you probably don't know what this looked like before. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples here. That was the darkest photograph I took. So then I went a stop up and a stop up and another stop up. And then the brightest one that I used to merge was this particular photograph. And you'll notice a couple of things. I've got some blue sky here. I've got a lot of space here. And this is also taken at 24 mm with a 14 to 24 mm lens. Now, there's several reasons why I did that. One is the 14 to 24 mm lens I know gives me excellent starburst. So I knew that this is the lens I wanted to use. I didn't want to use it at its widest angle because for those of you who've been to this location, I was shoulder to shoulder with a bunch of other photographers. So I didn't want to use any other lens because this is the lens that would give me the sharpest image and would also give me the best starburst that I was looking for. So I knew that I was going to be cropping the edges and possibly most of this area. And I'll go back to the final image here. As you can see, I've worked on this. I'm keeping some level of detail. I'm not making this too bright because I do want this to look like it was to my eye. This is a very hard photograph to take without HDR. You will almost surely either blow out the sky or you will lose detail in the foreground, as you've seen with that dark image and the brightest image that I used to put this HDR photo together. So you gotta almost pre-visualize what you want the photograph to look like. In this case, I was looking to do a panoramic format, but I did not want to stitch because the sun comes up very quickly. And the best way to get a good starburst, as you can see here, is partially obscuring the sun. And if I'm spending a lot of time taking several images, going across, that sun is moving too fast, and there's a possibility that I may not get the shot. So I chose um, to go with a crop in this particular situation, just because I'm working with a pretty high res camera anyway.
So why did you use one stop differential instead of fewer shots with two stop differential?
Okay, the reason for that is because when it pulls out the detail, it's taking detail from every photograph at different levels. So generally, I find that one stop works the best. I know that some people will even use 2/3 of a stop as well to get more detail, but I don't think that's true. I think with one stop, that's generally enough, because when you're putting the HDR together, it's the software is essentially getting detail from different parts of different images. And so one stop is usually enough. Two stops, I think, would possibly be too much. It could work in some situations, but in this situation, I didn't want to take the chance. And I find that just from experience, I feel like one stop apart usually works the best and gives me the most options. Okay, I'll continue. And talking about panoramas, just wanted to mention really quick, don't limit yourself to the aspect ratio of your specific camera. If you're shooting with a 4x4 camera, micro 4/3, or you're shooting with a DSLR camera, which gives you a 3x2 format, don't be restricted by that. Not everything needs to be in the specific aspect ratio that your camera gives you. You can always stitch images together, and this is a very simple panoramic of two horizontal images stitched together. And I did that because I wanted to get the sweep of the buttes over here. Of course, the subject, the focal point is the rain falling with the early morning sunlight hitting it. And I thought that was just pretty spectacular. It's something that I had never photographed before, and I just was so excited to have captured that and even seen it for that matter. In terms of processing, I'm still leaving it where it's more realistic. I'm not trying to bring out too much detail in the dark areas. And because if I do that, then I would take the attention somewhat away from the rain that's falling. And that's not something I wanted to do. I still wanted to highlight that because your eye tends to go to the brighter areas anyway. Oh, and you probably noticed that I've used a polarizer here as well. Again, just to give me a little bit of contrast. And generally, it's a good idea to not use a polarizer with a panoramic photo. But in this case, I'm shooting at a longer focal length. It's at about 82 mm. And I'm not shooting as wide, as in I don't have as many images to stitch together. And the reason for that is to not use a polarizer for something that you might be shooting a wider angle of view with, because the polarizer is affected by the position of the sun. And so as you move away from the sun, your skies might start to look a little different in one image than they do in the other. But surprisingly, I usually stitch these in Photoshop or Lightroom, mostly Lightroom these days. But the software does an amazing job of, even if you forget to take your polarizer off, 99% of the software will do just fine even with that. But it's a good idea not to use it if you're not to use the polarizer if you're taking a very wide angle of view in terms of your panoramic image. So challenging light, and you might think, oh, well, this is not really challenging light when you look at this, but the light was so flat. This was I had gone to Patagonia to photograph pumas, and I obviously didn't want to miss the opportunity to go into Torres del Paine. It's a beautiful park, and love the horns that you see here, the mountains in the background. And I wanted to at least get some photos that are, maybe not portfolio worthy, but at least worth showing. And it just happened to be a very, very overcast day. So This photograph in color is extremely low contrast, and there's very, very muted colors. There's literally um, no color worth speaking of. Very muted greens and the gray sky. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to find a subject which was very graphic. And the trees that I found here are very graphic and they catch your eye. And I figured that if I convert this to a black and white, which I finally did, I will be able to get a good contrast effect. You know, I've obviously really darkened the blacks over here just to highlight the graphic nature of these trees, and you know, a little bit of dodging in this area just to kind of lead the viewer's eye up towards the horns. And yeah, I was able to essentially drastically enhance the contrast in this particular image to uh, get a result that I thought that was worth showing. One of the most challenging situations is when you shoot into the light. I think flat light can be challenging, but you can do things in post-processing, just like that last particular photograph, to kind of overcome that. When you're shooting into the light, that's a really tough situation. You have to be extremely careful. I will often bracket photos like this because the light's changing so fast, and the sun is just out of the photograph. Or I shouldn't say it's just out of the photograph because it was in the photograph. I've actually cropped it out. And the reason I did that is a trick I use to get flare like this. So I'm deliberately keeping the light source in my photograph, which allows me to get this flare. And then in post-processing, obviously I can crop that, the brightest part out, and then I still have the effects of the flare in there. And I thought that was kind of cool. Obviously, I'm using the layers in the foreground or the base of the image to kind of give you something that's interesting. But then I allow the flare to kind of take over and kind of elevate the image from just being another photograph of the sand dune. So you can use the flare to your advantage at times. Shooting into the sun. So that in that last image, I've obviously kept this, cropped the sun out of it just because it was essentially blown out and way too bright. In this situation, I'm shooting directly into the sun, but the only reason I'm able to do this is because there's a wispy cloud layer in front. And so it just mutes the sun enough where I can still point my lens at it and get a decent shot. How do I expose for this? You have to shoot in manual. You simply cannot shoot in any automatic mode at all because you will guaranteed blow out the sun, because any automatic mode, you're going to be, the camera is going to be deciding what your exposure is. So you need to decide that. And the easiest way to do is take a shot, take a look, make the adjustment. So if it's too bright, you just dial your exposure down and get to where you want to be. And also in terms of post-processing, this was obviously very bright. This was fairly dark in my photograph, but I'm able to bring out a little bit of that dark area and essentially balance it visually so that it still looks appealing to the eye. And of course, waiting for that moment when that bird comes in is extremely key to this particular photograph. Now, yeah, I know I could have put that bird in later, but that's just not me. I should also point out one other thing. If you notice the exposure right down here on the right-hand side, you'll see I've shot this at f/16. I almost never shoot a wildlife action photograph at f/16. I never feel like I need that much depth of field. And most of the time I'm struggling for shutter speed anyway. So in this situation, because I'm shooting into the sun, it's so bright, I'm able to use a wide or a smaller aperture so that I can have a better chance at getting a sharp bird. I don't want the bird to be out of focus. So I'm extending the depth of field here to get a better chance at the bird being shot.
On this shot and the shot before, could you have accomplished some of the same things with like a graduated ND filter? sort of control the light on one side or the
So in this shot, definitely not, because I'm shooting with a 600 mm.
other?
I'm not, I don't know if anybody even uses a graduated filter with that. In post processing, of course, you can do that, but in the field, I could not with this photo. With the other photo, it could have helped a little bit, but the problem is when you're working with flare, and in that situation, I'll go back to that photo since we're talking about it. In this situation, I'm working with using the flare. And the problem with flare is the more glass you put in front of your lens or in front of the sensor, period, the more flare you'll get and the more unpredictable it becomes. So I tend to, whenever I'm shooting, when I'm trying to get flare, I will usually not use any filter at all, because already I'm working with lenses that have several elements of glass in it. I don't want to add a additional element of glass. But all the graduated ND filter would do in this situation would just be darkening the sky, which was not the goal in this particular situation. So
Right.
I would not have used it.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and as I said, with this particular photograph, I don't think that option was available anyway. So let's talk, we've already kind of started to get into it with the last couple of photographs where we're starting to distort reality. Now, when I say distort reality, we really start distorting reality the moment we actually pick up the camera and put a box around what we're seeing. So we're kind of starting there, but when I say distorting reality, we're essentially distorting it beyond what you see with the eye. That's what I mean by distorting reality. And in this situation, there are two things that are helping me do that. One is I've found a unique composition. When I'm shooting that acacia tree way in the background through this dead tree in the foreground, and I've framed that. But I also had a lot of haze. So the mountains in the background that were visible the day before were not visible this day. And there was a lot of haze. So I've actually brightened the image up. I've adjusted the contrast to the extent where the backgrounds essentially become white. And I'm keeping the detail to the minimalist side, even on the tree, just because I want it to be dark and I want that contrast to be stark. I'm more interested in the shape of the tree than trying to get detail in the tree here. And this becomes more about the shapes more than anything else. And of course, when you go to a black and white image, you're kind of enhancing that abstract feel because it's no longer what we see with the eye. Doing something similar here, but now I'm doing it with an animal in the photograph. This is essentially called the high key technique, where everything gets brightened to the point where you almost have some areas of the image that could be blown out or have detailless white. And that's what I'm looking to do here. I'm trying to, excuse me, I'm trying to distort reality by converting it to black and white, but also brightening it to a point where you normally not see it. Of course, I've worked with a little bit of the contrast so I can get more detail out of the leopard as well. But here's what could have been a very average photograph, which actually ended up, to my eye, becoming one of my favorite photographs from my Kenya trip last year. And the reason for that is the post-processing. But when I was taking the photograph, I was already thinking of what I would do with this photograph afterwards in terms of the post-processing. So I definitely wanted to get or make sure the leopard's face and eyes were mostly in the sun and not in the deep shade, because that might have affected how the eyes were rendered later. So this is a pretty unique, and it's becoming more popular, the high key effect, and people are starting to use this a lot more. But I feel like with any tool that we have as photographers, I think you shouldn't overuse it. There's specific situations for specific tools, and you should know when to use those tools in those situations. Here's something that you may or may not know. Your camera can actually do this in camera. So this is multiple exposure. This is 10 photos where I've actually taken the camera, moved it up vertically as I'm taking each photograph. And if you look carefully, you'll actually see the steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's about 10 of them. I know it's very hard to see all 10. Um, but I wanted to keep this photograph very subtle. It's low contrast. It's taken with the snow. It was grayish sky. So I'm keeping it very subtle. This is more about evoking emotion, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit here. This is more about kind of starting to get to that, but I've essentially distorted reality because I'm not showing you trees. I'm showing you trees, but I'm showing you how the trees have been rendered differently just because I envision them that way. And that's what I really encourage people to do, is like to see things beyond what they're seeing. And so it's important to be inspired. And immersing yourself in that situation, in that moment, is so important because that's one of the best ways to start to think about evoking emotion in your photograph. Because if you're not there, if you're not present, you're just taking photos, they'll tend to look like snapshots. How we feel, believe it or not, somehow works its way into our photographs. And yes, I could talk about that a lot more, but at the very basis of that is to be inspired and to be in the moment. And something as simple as this, where the light is really inspiring me, and of course, I'm just panning a little bit with the waves at 1/4 of a second here. And I'm just getting enough motion in the waves to kind of create that movement as well. So this becomes not a photograph of water or not a photograph of the highlights or anything like that. This is beyond that. This is trying to evoke an emotion. So when somebody sees this, they're not thinking, oh, well, this is a photograph of water. It's just how they feel becomes more important. And then the other way to approach it is to start to think beyond what you're seeing. So think about what the camera can see. And that's a very powerful thought, because when you think about it, the camera never sees anything the way we see it with our eye. We always did, and I talked about distorting reality. We're always using shallower depth of field. We're using more depth of field to get focus from front to back. Our eyes don't exactly see that way. And so in this case, our eye doesn't see motion. But because I'm actually taking the camera and moving the camera around, and if you're wondering what this is actually foam bubbles on the water. And because there's a high contrast, the sun has gotten up high enough, I'm using the Singh-Ray variable ND filter so I can get a slower shutter speed. And this allows me to create the motion with the camera. And there's a lot of experimenting in this particular technique, because what I was looking to do was to get some kind of flow. And you see the motion that I have here, it's kind of like a wave-like motion. And that's what I was looking to do with this particular photograph, because I didn't want it to be a straight line. I feel like that's almost like too easy to create. And that could almost be a mistake. But something like this, it takes a little bit of experimentation, but eventually you might take 10, 15, 20, 30 photos, but if you practice enough, you will end up with a couple of really nice photographs that will capture what you're seeing, or what you're trying to get the camera to see, I should say.
On the slide right before that,
Mm-hmm.
someone wanted to know if you used a tripod for that.
This one, no, it's handheld. I'm both these photos, this one of the waves and this one of the foam bubbles on the waves, were both taken handheld, because I want to be free to be able to move the camera in any direction I want. So I felt like the tripod was too restrictive in this situation.
And then someone else said that they noticed you use the 28 to 300 mm lens a lot. Why do you like it so much?
Well, it's versatile. And I find it all, and some of these photos are actually taken during workshops as well. So I use it as a way to teach as well, because instead of changing lenses and showing somebody, oh, well, this is what you can do if you go a little wider, and this is what you can do if you go tighter, I find that having the 28 to 300 mm on, I can quickly take a photograph, show it to somebody, and then help somebody else on my workshop. It is very versatile. It has some weak points. It's not the sharpest lens. I never shoot it below f8. Below f8, I might as well throw those photographs away if I try and I'm trying to get a sharp photograph. So I literally don't shoot it. I'm always shooting it between f8 and f16. That's usually where I'm shooting that lens. It also has a very soft corner, so I tend to compose a little loosely so I can crop those soft corners out. So yeah, it's very versatile, but I know where the weak points lie, so I usually will avoid those as much as I can. But the main reason I use it is just because I can do so many things with it. Okay. So talking about evoking emotion, and everybody probably knows where this is taken, Yosemite National Park, that's El Capitan. This is a moonlit shot. You can see the stars on the top left corner here. And the reason I was able to get this photograph was only because I connected to this subject. And when I say I connected to the subject, this was taken on my first visit to Yosemite. And I simply was just taken aback by these granite walls and the size and scale of them, that I just, I kept wanting to look up and just take them in. And I wanted to capture something that had some mood to it, that captured these American icons in a different way. And I decided I was going to try and come out at night, and I looked to see when the moon was going to be rising. And so I timed it so that I got there just right about at moonrise, and I was able to get this particular photograph. I did luck out with one thing, is the atmosphere. And the clouds kind of moving across the scene. I think that just really made the photo. And by the way, that's an accident. I think all the metadata here is wrong. That is not, I think I've made a mistake. I might have copied the slide and I did not fill this up. This was taken with a 24 to 70 mm lens, closer to that 24 mm side. This was taken at about f11, and it was a 30-second exposure, not 2/50th of a second. It was, the ISO, I believe, was about 1600 as well. So sorry about that, but all those things needed to happen for me to get this particular photograph. But in the end, it's about connecting with your subject. If you don't have a connection with your subject, then I don't see how or why you should even take the photograph. It's not just because you're there, because at that point you're starting to not be an artist, you're more just documenting where you've been. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. My whole presentation here is more focused on trying to be creative and getting photographs, beyond what you'd get, with the average snapshot. Wildlife images can get pretty, I guess, almost monotonous, because you see one, you see them all, yes, it'll be a different bird, but the wings will be in great position. But at some point, and it's great when you're starting out, you're getting birds in flight, etc. Everything seems pretty awesome because there's a lot of technical knowledge that goes into taking wildlife photographs. And once you've kind of mastered that, then it kind of unleashes or allows you to unleash your creative potential, because now you can start to think of, well, now what can I do with this bird in flight? And now this specific situation was really unique. Number one is this was dew covered. This was a dew covered setting where all the grass had dew on it, and obviously waiting for that right moment. But there's another aspect to it. When I say waiting for that right moment, of course, where the bird is descending into the grass with a fish. You can't quite see it at this scale, but there's a fish in its beak. And of course, getting the wing position the way I wanted to. But the distance was very important. And why is the distance important here? Because what makes this photograph for me is the orbs, right? In the foreground and the background. if my focus is further, so if the bird is further in the photograph and my focus is on the bird, the orbs in the background become very large, and I don't really have many orbs in the background. And on the other end of the spectrum, if the bird is too close, I'll get a nice background. I'll get a lot of orbs in the background, but I may not get anything in the foreground. So the bird needed to be exactly where it was for me to get this particular photograph where it's kind of surrounded by orbs. And you can see there's a very slim layer of depth of field right there. And once again, you'll notice that I'm using a long focal length, 840 mm, and my aperture is pretty much wide open. So at 5.6, I'm getting the shallowest depth of field I can possibly get. And one other tip with regards to getting orbs, shooting wide open, you'll get a more circular orb. The more you stop down, you start to get a hexagon, because that orb is the shape of the aperture itself. So as when you stop down, the aperture closes, and as the aperture closes, you start to see the shape more than you do when it's wide open. And I'll end with this one last photograph where it's kind of a mix of abstraction, distorting reality, but I'm also evoking a certain emotion in this particular photograph. You may or may not recognize this, but there's a very popular waterfall called Bridal Veil Falls in Yosemite. I was driving past, and I will often do this during late morning or early evening. I like to look for new opportunities, and I came across this, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. But really what I needed to do here, and if you're wondering what all the effect in the foreground is, it's nothing but the water from the waterfall that was essentially being sprayed everywhere. There was a lot of breeze, and therefore the spray from the waterfall was essentially all over the place. It took me several attempts to get a photo where I did not have the front of my lens totally soaked. So when I first started to take this photograph, I figured out the composition. I took some shots, and as you can see, this tree is deliberately placed right in front of that waterfall so that you can actually see the tree, because if it was a little bit to the left or the right, you wouldn't see it. And this way, I'm kind of using the frame of the two trees on the side as well to kind of bring your attention towards the center of the image. But really, this is a great situation where I'm able to transform what would have been a mundane subject. I mean, everybody takes photos of Bridal Veil Falls, but because of that effect of the spray being all over and I essentially dousing myself and my camera, I was able to get a photograph like this. So never be restricted by what you see. Always keep thinking of what you can do with your image, and how your final product can be beyond what is a simple, basic photograph. Thank you. And Michelle, if you have questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Yeah, we've got a few. Going back to the bird into the sun shot.
The bird, yes. Mm-hmm.
So did you use manual focus on that?
Yes, it was manual focus and manual exposure. And that's one of the reasons the reason it was manual focus was because I didn't want to be tracking the birds. And that's why I used F16 as well, so that I had a good, it's not a great depth of field, but it was a good depth of field and enhances my opportunity to get a bird that was sharp. There was a layer of grass which I cropped out at the very bottom of the screen. And that's where I had focused, because the birds were kind of flying in that focal plane. And that's what I was looking for. And so I pre-focused there, put it to manual focus, shifted my camera up to get the composition I wanted. And then as the birds flew by, I kept clicking away, hoping to get something that was a good shape and in the right position.
And then the same image, with the camera low to the ground and the bird's legs obscured by sand,
Mm-hmm.
Did you use a clear filter to protect the front lens element?
No, so I'm shooting with a 600 mm lens where the hood itself is about 5-6 inches deep. And I did not, it wasn't a windy day, so I didn't have that issue where I needed to protect the front element. So I was able to get low and not worry about that. And generally that's one of the good things about shooting with uh, that lens. And I always keep the hood on for pretty much all my lenses, is that the hoods will often do a great job of protecting the front element as well. So I almost never use it. I have one clear UV filter that I always keep in my bag, but I think it's been a few years since I've used it, because I would only use it in a very specific situation where I simply had to use it to protect the front element. And that could be like, for an example could be ocean spray. So I don't want salt water to get on the front of my lens. So that would be a good situation to use it.
And then, does using texture in your images give more variations of your subject?
When they say texture, maybe they can clarify. Are we talking post-processing, or are we just talking about finding texture naturally in your subject? I'm going to take it as the latter, and I'll answer the question that way. If there's a clarification, I can get into that again. But yes, definitely texture in images helps, but it's not a necessity, and it's often the most overlooked factor in a particular image. You often distracted by color, shapes, lines, etc. Graphic elements tend to attract more of your attention than texture might, but very often in images, the texture is almost like that last bit to help you complete the image. So I often find that it's a very important part of the image.
And on the Mesa Arch shot,
Mhm.
did you use the same exposure settings for all 4 HDR shots?
Uh, well, it's not exactly the same exposure, because I am changing the exposure by one stop each. But yes, in terms of my ISO staying the same and my aperture staying the same, yes. What changes is just the shutter speed to change the exposure. So each one of those was one stop apart.
And then, if you're taking 4 photos, each 80 seconds, and the sun is moving, when combining the photos, will it work?
Yes. And those photos have to be taken pretty quickly. You can't be taking a shot and then hanging out, talking to your friend, and taking another shot. So they're taken pretty much one after the other, and almost in rapid fire mode, just so that the sun is barely moved. And again, the software, in terms of its alignment, etc., as I mentioned earlier, it does take parts of the image from the different images that are available, depending on the amount of detail that's there. That's kind of how the HDR software works. So it's never been an issue as long as those photos are taken rapidly, one after the other.
And then an interesting and timely question. Do you have any tips on photographing the protests that are going on right now?
Believe it or not, I'm not a people photographer. You've probably not even seen one photograph of a person in there. But if I was to photograph the protests, and if the people were moving, I'd set up a tripod somewhere and hopefully get motion in the people moving, just to show how many people are there and how they're moving forward. And I feel like that would also kind of convey the movement of the BLM movement as well. So movement, I guess, is a pun.
Was the 80-second time the total exposure for all the photos combined or individually?
No, so I obviously had to show you only one. I think that's what it showed me at the end. I don't recall. Each one was different. So each one was at a different shutter speed. I just don't recall whether there was, I guess they were faster, because the darker ones would have been faster. This one would have probably been the last one, which was the brightest one.
And do you use auto ISO on your birds in flight?
Birds in flight, never, because the backgrounds will change. Birds can fly in the sky, they'll move. You might get trees in the background. They might end up landing on a branch, or on the beach, etc. So the backgrounds change. auto modes are not good for changing backgrounds. For changing backgrounds, you always want to use manual. And pretty much most of my wildlife photography, I shoot in manual just because I know that no matter where the animal might move, I'll still get a consistent exposure.
And then do you do in-camera action multiple exposures?
Income camera action multiple exposures. I think I know what they mean. So if like, for example, a bird is flying, if I do in camera multiple exposures, I've tried that. However, the results were not to my liking, just because when the subject is moving that much, it's very hard to keep it in the exact area of the frame of your composition. So I find it didn't work as well. So I've not really played around with that as much. I do obviously use it with static subjects a lot.
Okay. And then this one's more of a comment about the washed out photo that you showed towards the beginning. He said, that is very, very brave. Very few people will have the guts of showing an out of camera shot. Everyone these days says we will kill it in post.
Well, the reason I showed that was only just to show what your photograph is before and what it can become. And to me, the way I'm approaching this webinar as I approach any form of teaching, whether it's online teaching or workshops, is I'm not afraid to show my mistakes, so I'm not afraid to show what my raw files look like. I feel like, if I'm instructing somebody, I'm instructing them to learn and give them the opportunity to learn everything that I know. So I'm not going to hold back and not show something just because I want to look like that pro photographer that never makes a mistake. Well, guess what? We all make mistakes.
It's true. And I've heard a couple of speakers say too that there is no such thing as a mistake in photography. If you like the image, then you're good.
Yeah, every mistake is a learning experience. That's the way I look at it.
I think that's it for the questions. So I want to thank you so much for your time. I hope everyone will join us next month. We have photographing the Milky Way, star trails, and the moon with Vinnie Colucci. And then after that, we've got Colleen Miniuk joining us again. So go to singray.com/webinars to see upcoming webinars and sign up now. And then again, Nikhil, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you to Singh-Ray for having me. Thanks, everybody.